Chains like this were used to make chainmail armor. The difference between this and chainmail armor is that I'm simply taking a letter O with a slit in it and butting those things up against one another, and it's decorative. It can be extremely strong, but it is decorative. If I want to have chainmail armor that is actually safely functional by pre-1600 standards, that doesn't mean that it's going to be safely functional by modern standards, because modernly some people do use this kind of a link for chainmail armor. These two ends in a real piece of chainmail armor would have overlapped, so it would have done that, the two ends. Instead of doing this the way they do in a ring, they would have done that. And then there would have been a rivet put right through that section where they overlap. So in pre-1600 and post-1600 for that matter, chainmail armor, good quality chainmail armor is riveted. So every single one of those rings that you see in what they call a coat of mail, which is a shirt, usually that comes down to here, and then you usually have some other kind of armor here, and it's like a t-shirt, and it falls down usually hip length, crotch length, because you want this whole torso area covered. Every single one of those links would have been riveted. Takes a lot longer than the process I'm doing here. A lot longer. It also produces a much sturdier thing, but you don't need your necklaces riveted. Once in a while someone will ask, well, gee, is it possible to solder these? Yes, it is possible. I actually have friends who have the capability to use a little teeny tiny jeweler's arc welder to close the rings completely. You can only do it, I would think you could only do it with certain metals. It's normally done on gold, and it should also work on fine silver. I don't know about the other details because I don't own a small jeweler's arc welder. They cost as much as a new car, and or at least a used car. They are making some less expensive ones now because quote-unquote permanent jewelry has become popular. Permanent jewelry, for anyone who's not aware of what it is basically you get a thin bracelet or a necklace or something. It's usually bracelets or an anklet, and they actually weld it in place on your wrist, and it's on there until it breaks or you cut it off. Okay? Not on my list of things to do. Some people love it because they don't have to think about it. They've always got jewelry on. Okay? I like thinking about things like that, so I guess I'm just different. So anyway, the twisted chains here, like this, are a different pattern. I learned this online. I simply went to one of the websites that shows chain link patterns. If you Googled for chain link patterns or chainmail patterns. Chainmail, you might actually get the sheets, but they'll usually have other things in there too. And I read the instructions and I followed the instructions and it worked. I run across people all the time who have read the instructions and followed the instructions but missed an important point. And that's that point that I was talking to you about that says you have to keep the chain under tension. I'll show you what happens. Let's see if I can do this in a relatively speedy fashion. So I'm going to put a link in there. I'm going to close the link. Oops. And you do have to expect to drop these things. That's why I always am doing this on a tray table when I'm watching TV, because you're going to drop it. It's inevitable. And the beginning on this stuff is always a bit klutzy. The beginnings on the simple 1-in-1 or 2-in-1 are easy. The twisted one is a little more clever in terms of knowing where to put the link. Come on. It's much easier as you go on and you have a larger piece to hold with one hand. And sometimes when I'm doing this to start with, I kind of screw up. But the nice thing is, it's nothing permanent, so you can always take something apart if you get it messed up. I'm simply feeding that in there. But you'll notice that every time I let go of it, it falls into this little cascade of nothingless looking rings. The way one of the people who came to me asking how the heck I did this, explained it, was that they were making this stuff while watching television. It was going great. They got up to use the bathroom, and when they came back, they had this pile of uncontrolled rings that were hooked together that didn't look like anything. And they just sort of freaked out, I guess, and didn't know what to do. Well, don't freak out. Just go back and twist it. I'll show you what I mean in just a minute here. You can see I'm creating a short length of chain here. Now I am still being careful, even though I hadn't necessarily planned to make this, because I will use it. I need to have a large quantity of chains with me so that I'm not scrambling at the event. I do have the ability to do a certain amount of manufacturing at the event, where I have a tumbler to do the polishing, and I have another machine to do a certain amount of other kinds of polishing on things. But my goal is to have as much of this sort of thing done as possible so that I can focus on custom work and just, waiting on customers and stuff like that. So, let's make a couple more rings. So I think this is going to become moderately obvious in a minute here. But you see how every time I suspend that chain of rings from my pliers in order to close a ring, it just sort of flops. Oops, I have to be careful, make sure I get it right. There we go. And like I say, the nice thing about this sort of thing is it's not permanent if you want it not to be permanent. So if you mess up the position of a link, just take it out. It's not the end of the world. You haven't, assuming you haven't overflexed your rings, which you notice I move the things as little as possible. Assuming I haven't overflexed my rings in some fashion or used a really brittle metal, it's fine. Now, if I hold that like that, it doesn't look like a spiral. And that's what people were finding. They would leave it down and they would pick it up and they would say, oh, my spiral's broken. Take the bottom of the spiral and twist it. And you now have a spiral. See, it requires the tension of being in a complete loop in order to maintain that spiral. It's actually pretty cool. But it means that you cannot sell this as anything other than a complete loop. So if someone were to come to me and say, I want this as a bracelet, I'd say you have to be able to slide it over your hand like a bangle, because I can't make it as anything other than a complete loop. It won't stay. You'll wind up with that, which is not what you're looking for. So it's pretty cool. Okay, I am going to take you guys down to the studio and I'm going to show you how to cut links. Before I do that, let me talk about the links a little bit. If you were to look at these links up close, you would notice that the two edges are extremely flat. The biggest mistake that a lot of people make when they go to create some sort of a link like this is they cut them with some sort of dikes or some other cutting mechanism that has a point on it like that. So you've got 2 points that come together, chomp, 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 like that. And they're both like a chisel. They both are V-shaped. And when you cut something with a V-shaped cutter, what you wind up with is a V-shaped piece of metal. So if I have a V-shaped piece of metal on this side and a V-shaped piece of metal on this side, they are never going to form a perfect, nicely matched edge that virtually disappears when properly polished. It will also, long-term, usually damage your clothes. Sometimes it's scratchy. Depends on how bad a job you've done. I have seen some that were just unforgivable. I've scolded people for it, to be honest, because you're making a gift for somebody, but you're giving them something that's going to ruin their clothes because they've given them a lovely set of design plaques with chain in between, but those chains are all jagged because you made them with pieces that come together like this. Let me get my fingers out of the way. There we go. Where the ends of the wire look like that instead of things that come together nice and tight like that. This, when it's properly polished, will give you a very smooth, it's comfortable in your hand. This has not been polished yet. This has been. There's almost no roughness in here at all. You could feel the twist of the chain, but there's nothing sharp in there that makes it uncomfortable in your hand. These have just been finished, so they haven't been through the tumbler yet. But once these are tumbled, and even now, this is still not uncomfortable to run your hand on, and neither is this. I can feel there's a little teeny bit of roughness there because the edges are not 100% perfect on those two butt ends to the wires, but I'll also be adjusting. Like I can see that this guy is a teeny bit off. That's why I say we always go back and do quality assurance. He's a tiny bit off. And all I do is I move the tension a little bit in the ring. So he's smoother now. So that spot won't be as rough the next time I run my hand on it. But I can polish off 99% of these rough spots, and it'll be a very comfortable thing. It won't be damaging your clothes. If you have the kind of ends on the wire where you've got sharp points like that, they will hook into your clothes. They'll abrade the fabric. I would not buy something that was made that way. It shows a lack of understanding of good manufacturing techniques. And to be honest, I have looked at a lot of pre-1600s jewelry because people will say, oh, well, people did it this way. And I'm like, no, they didn't. I've looked at tons and tons and tons of pieces of pre-1600 jewelers, and I have never, ever seen something that was cut that way and turned into a chain. Now, there's lots of other kinds of chains besides this, besides these patterns, but I have never, some of them are soldered, and there's some that are twisted in all kinds of unusual shapes and stuff, really not particularly used modernly in terms of the designs. They're actually a fairly complex pattern of twisted links and things like that. I have never seen that ragged end on any of this stuff. So that tells me it was not acceptable. Now they do things, particularly Vikings, do things like tying the wire as if with the way we would tie like string almost. They'll wrap things and things like that, which would not normally kind of be our standards today. But obviously when I do reproduction pieces, I do it the way it was done. You still make sure those things aren't sharp. You still touch them with your fingers, make sure there's no little burrs sticking out anywhere, and use a fine file. We have no evidence that they did that, but we also don't normally find pieces that have a lot of bits and pieces sticking out as burrs. And with fabric being an incredibly expensive and important item, ruining some lady's dress with a piece of carelessly manufactured jewelry sounds like a good way to get whacked on the head by somebody. that's pretty much the basic thing of what I'm doing while I'm watching TV lately is I'm making these. I'm making these. I'll also be making more of these, which are just a simply different color. This is red brass, and which polishes up to a really nice gold color. And this is a nickel silver. Nickel silver looks like silver. It's actually a little grayer than silver, but for most people it looks like silver. The disadvantage is if you are allergic to nickel, you shouldn't wear it. But nickel silver is simply just another alloy of copper and brass and all that other stuff. It's just literally, if you go to order it through an industrial supply, it's in the brass department because it is just another number. It just contains nickel instead of, you know, the simpler metals. So if you're not allergic to it, you can wear it. It doesn't tarnish as easily as brass does. The different brasses will tarnish at different rates too. This red brass will eventually become sort of a brown color. It also polishes up just fine again if you want to repolish it. The yellow brasses are a bit yellower. I use those for making things that need to be a little stiffer. And there are also bronzes, which is simply a copper and tin combination. That also will go sort of gold like this when it's bright and shiny new. It'll be a little redder than the red brass. And it will go brown when it's completely tarnished. Tarnish is just the same thing as rust. That's what rust is. It's oxidation of the surface of the metal. So, generally speaking, you can polish it back off without any problem, and make it all shiny again if you want to. I do occasionally polish people's knights chains. I've had those requests, you know, where someone looked at what their husband was wearing and turned to me and said, "What would it take to make his chain shiny like this?" And I'm like. And I think I charged $5 for it. $5 in an hour because it takes me an hour to put it in the tumbler and then make sure it's dry before I hand it back to him. And she's like, "Sold. Here's your $5." I don't usually do that, but on special requests, I have done that before. It's not that hard to polish it. Anyone who's got a tumbler set up that's used for doing stone polishing can do that sort of thing. And they're readily available at places like Harbor Freight for cheap these days. You don't have to buy the expensive ones. I have 2 expensive ones and 1 cheap one. I use the cheap one when I travel. And it works just fine. And it has worked just fine for years and years. I have replaced belts on it. I always carry extra belts because after about 4 years, the belt dies. Okay, I can afford like a $3 belt every 4 years. I'm good with that. So, yeah. Okay, so down to the studio, and I'll show you guys how we make rings.